Burning Point. Overviews, insights, and analysis on hot issues of global significance. Brought to you on weekdays by the Voice of Russia.
Hello, and welcome to the show with me, Ekaterina Kudashkina.
And me, Dan Moody.
Today, we shall look into the role of the international organizations in keeping law and order in the global scale. Well, the UN Security Council Resolution 1973, viewed by some of the leading global players as a warrant for military intervention into a sovereign state, unauthorized military action by the UN and French forces in Côte d'Ivoire, all these, as well as some of the earlier events, produce a nasty impression that international organizations' authority is being eroded and international legislation is no longer respected.
Could that really be the case? And is the role of international bodies really diminished? What could that imply, and is there any way to restore the respect for law and order in the global scale?
So we have tried to explore the issue with the help from our experts, Giulietta Chiesa, former member of the European Parliament and one of the most experienced Italian journalists covering international relations, and Dr. Boris Shmelyov, head of the Center for Political Studies with the Institute of Economics, Russian Academy of Sciences, in Moscow, Russia. So, look Dan, now I suggest we could start with a brief survey of the recent developments in Africa.
Well, according to some of the news wires on the 4th of April, which was Monday, the French military mission Unicorn, together with the UN peacekeeping force stationed in Côte d'Ivoire, engaged in military action.
But the trick is that the UN peacekeeping force is not supposed to be engaged in any military action. They are supposed to remain neutral, not to take sides, and are deployed mostly to supervise how peace agreements are carried out by conflicting parties. So that is what the UN peacekeeping force is for, and that's what the UN Security Council's mandate defining the status of the so-called blue helmets is all about, you know.
So what exactly is this conflict going on in Côte d'Ivoire?
Well, for more than 6 months already, the country's former president, Laurent Gbagbo, who has been refusing to recognize his defeat at presidential elections, and he still keeps offering armed resistance to the new government of the president-elect, Alassane Ouattara, you know.
So in this case, though, what did they do? Did they attack the former president?
Well, you can say so. Rather his headquarters, because they delivered several airstrikes on positions which were quite close to the president's residence. And now Russia intends to look into the legitimacy of the use of force by UN peacekeepers in Côte d'Ivoire. And that's what Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who's been visiting another African country of Gabon, said at a press conference after the talks with the Gabonese Foreign Minister Paul Tanguy.
But then there was the situation on Monday when Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said that despite having opened fire on one of Gbagbo's military bases, the UN was still not party to the conflict in the Ivory Coast.
Well, it's interesting because in his statement, Ban Ki-moon said that he had instructed the UN peacekeeping mission in Ivory Coast, and I quote, to take the necessary measures to prevent the use of heavy weapons against the civilian population with the support of French forces.
So this would seem more in line with the peacekeeping definition.
Of course. They're not supposed to launch strikes.
Well, yeah, it would be silly. But, I mean, then you've got the French government who's repeatedly called on Gbagbo to step down, and they said on Tuesday its role in the helicopter attacks on his military was justified. And then, just let me quote, "It's the international community that has recognized Alassane Ouattara, the president-elect, by the Ivorian people, and we are applying the democratic will of the people." And that was mentioned by a French government spokesman.
You know, Dan, this only reminds me of a situation in Libya, where protection of civilian population was also used as a pretext to start military operation in that country, and there was also the talk of imposing democratic will. But really, then I fail to understand what democracy is about, because as far as I understand, democracy is something about listening to the majority of the population. So as regards to Libyan operation, the majority of the population in those countries who have been launching that operation were against launching the military strikes in Libya.
Well, of course, and then the strikes which have been launched by the international coalition have, obviously resulted in civilian casualties as well.
That's right. And again, the French warplanes were the first ones to attack Libyan targets, weren't they?
That's right, but this whole issue now of the coalition being involved in Libya and the situation unfolding in Côte d'Ivoire really raises a lot of questions, though.
Oh, you can't even imagine what kind of questions. And some of them have come as a real surprise, not only to the wider public, but to the US legislators in the Capitol Hill. But first, let's listen to Giulietta Chiesa, former member of the European Parliament and Italian journalist covering international relations.
Burning Point.
Mr. Chiesa, first of all, thank you very much for joining us. So, the subject of today's program would be the legitimacy of decisions of international organizations and their role in today's political environment, so to say. Well, for instance, the official representative of the French government said that the only reason why French troops have been engaged in combat in Côte d'Ivoire was that the French government was asked by Mr. Ban Ki-moon about that. So the whole picture does seem a little bit sinister to me, but perhaps I'm wrong. So how do you see that? How legitimate have been the recent decisions of the United Nations and international organizations in general?
Well, in this case, I believe that you are right when you believe that it is a little bit sinister, this kind of declaration, because it demonstrates that in this moment there is no legitimacy at all from the international community about the acts and decisions they take. This is clearly illegal because Mr. Ban Ki-moon has no any possibility, juridical possibility to ask straight personally to a chief of state of government to intervene in another country. He has no legitimacy, and if it is true, it is a completely illegal act. But I would like to remember you that some weeks ago we assisted to another very, very serious and much more important violation of all the rules of international law when the Security Council of the United Nations approved with a large majority and with the abstention of China, Germany, and Russia, a resolution giving the right to intervene militarily on a territory of a sovereign state like Libya. This was a clear, evident violation of the same chart of the United Nations, while in the third paragraph of this chart it is written clearly that such a military intervention would be acceptable, would be legal, only if this state will violate peace and international security, which never happened because Libya did not menace any international security and certainly not the international peace. That means the Security Council voted a resolution cancelling completely the fundamentals of the Chart of the United Nations. That means you are fully right when you say that it is a worrying situation when all the rules of international law are violated by the international community.
Mr. Chiesa, but is there any clause in any international law which envisages the intervention to protect the civil population, like, well, a pretext that was used in the case of Libya?
Well, it was a pretext. Now we know that it was a pretext because many documents are appearing now in the last days that shows that there was no mass killing in Libya. And the first information which has been given by Al Jazeera, for instance, speaking of 10,000 dead was absolutely false, and so on. And the mass graves in Libya never have been shown, and many other things we know now. And I would like to add that now we know that France and Great Britain organized, signed the pact in November 2010, that means many months before the beginning of this war, signed a pact to defend themselves. This is more or less the official formulation, which has been published on internet, and it is possible to see on internet, calling for such a kind of military exercise named Southern Mistral 2011. And in this document it is written that the military action from the part of France and Great Britain should be engaged between March 21st, 25. That means we have in this military exercise the full description with 4 months in advance of the aggression against Libya. That means all the argumentation according to which the intervention has been done for humanitarian reason is completely false, and it was a pretext. But I would like to add that there is no one rule in the international law giving authorization to intervene militarily against a state for humanitarian reason. Probably somebody would like to have this rule, but till now this rule does not exist, and probably it would be very good, very interesting if the General Assembly of the United Nations will discuss the introduction of this rule, but this rule has to be very attentively, very seriously examined and approved, and we have not any approval of this kind.
Just to remind listeners, this is Giulietto Chiesa, former member of the European Parliament and Italian journalist covering international relations.
You're tuned to the Voice of Russia.
And Mr. Chiesa, now you have just mentioned the United Nations, but if we remember the role of the United Nations in the war against Iraq, if we remember what we have just seen now in the case of Libya, doesn't it seem to you that the role of international legislation and the respect for the decisions of international bodies, as well as their own stance, are in a crisis, so to say?
Well, it was evident at that time, but in the case of the intervention in Iraq, you know that it was illegitimate intervention, one-side intervention decided by the United States. It was clear at that moment, and many in Europe and all over the world understood that it was a violation of the law. But I would like to come back to another situation, which was the decision to intervene in Afghanistan. This decision has been taken under the approval of the Security Council, but now we know that this approval was concocted, was not honestly and really taken, this decision, because the United Nations was given a false interpretation of the events. Officially, immediately after 9/11, 2001, the government of the United States told that they have the proof of the participation of Osama bin Laden in the operation against the United States. But this proof has never been shown. There was a meeting at the beginning of October at the NATO headquarters with the participation of all the ambassadors of the NATO. And in that meeting, we know that no proof was being shown. There was a declaration telling that the United States had the proof, but no proof has been shown. That means the United Nations gave a legitimation to the intervention in Afghanistan having been given false information. That means we are in front now, it is clear, but nobody wants to speak clearly about that and publicly. We are in front of a clear violation of the bona fide of the Security Council. That means all what happened in the last 10 years, including the so-called war, international war against terrorism, has been based on a falsification, on a violation of rules, and so on. We have lived the last 10 years in a full, complete international illegality.
And if we analyze what the United Nations has been doing, as well as the International Monetary Fund, for instance, as well as the World Bank, it seems to be quite clear that those bodies are acting in the best interest of their major shareholder, which is the United States. What is to be done? Is there anything to be done to restore the international law and order?
Well, I believe that it is a very difficult task because in this moment we are in a particular situation. I wish I should describe this way. We are in a situation where the main shareholders are those organizing and producing dollars. That means we are under the domination of one currency, which became the world currency. And this is a situation which has been accepted by the whole international community for many, many years after Bretton Woods. But this situation has already changed, and from this point we are in a very serious and dangerous situation, because in this situation we are in a situation, is a condition where the dollar is dominating the world market, and that means the United States are dominating the world markets. But this picture is not corresponding to the reality. For instance, China is a very large and decisive role in the international situation. The euro has a very large and decisive role. The dollar, that means it is not in condition, and we know that it is not in condition to dominate the world. That means we have a situation where political power of a country, United States, does not correspond anymore to the real situation of the international community. And we are, for that reason, in a big danger, because the United States are the most powerful and armed nation of the world. And that means this nation would have to accept the idea to divide its own power with other protagonists. But they don't do that. They continue to push in a situation, in the old situation. This is the origin, I believe, of the turmoil we are going in now.
What is your forecast?
Well, I believe that till when the rest of the world will not be able to compel the United States to accept the new situation, the situation will become more and more unstable. For that reason, I believe that the danger of war is growing, not a little war, but a big war, because, the situation is absolutely untenable for a long time. It can last for some 5, 7, 10 years maximum, not more. I remember that in a 5-year, we will have in front of us not one China, but 1.5 China. And at that moment, that means in a 5-year time, we will have a situation which clearly will not be tenable for a serious peace situation.
Well, Mr. Chiesa, thank you very much. Just to remind you, our guest speaker was Giulietta Chiesa, former member of the European Parliament and Italian journalist.
You are listening to the Voice of Russia, one of the oldest radio stations in the world.
So this is kind of a grim-sounding forecast, really, I suppose.
Well, it certainly is, but as you know, we need another opinion to confirm or perhaps to counter the first one. And so in search of that, I turned to Dr. Boris Shmylov, head of the Center for Political Studies with the Institute of Economics, Russian Academy of Sciences. So he believes that the role of the international organizations is growing, but his analysis of the current trends in the global politics, presents a picture which is even more disturbing than the one described by Mr. Chiesa.
The resolution of the United Nations Organization number 1973 about Libya reflects the new situation in the world and in the international relations, which means that the role of the nation state is becoming more important in the modern world and reflect the growing role of the international organization. In fact, in modern time, when the globalization is the mainstream of our time, needs the global governance and global government in connection with the global character of the financial capital. Financial capital is directed to the breaking of the border between states, is orienting on the organization of building up the structures, international structures, which can and which is able to play this role of international governments. And from this point of view, the situation in Libya and its leader, Gaddafi, didn't want to play all the role of these powerful international forces. And it's clear that he had no chances to play this role in the future because his policy, and I can say his existing, was the challenge to the interests of this international power, to the interests of this international financial capital. And I think this situation is evident, and we can have in the future more situation like the situation around Libya. The role, from this point of view, the role of international organization is growing, and the resolutions of United Nations Organization will put to changing the character of modern international relations. Now, international community can invite into the internal domestic policy of concrete states to change the political and social environment in this country. And we can see now the trends of restructuring of the modern situation, of the modern face of the world, where every country, every state must play the role which was defined by these forces reflected the interests of financial capital. The situation was worked out for many years ago, and it's not something new from politological point of view. The ideology of this policy was prepared by Bilderberg's club and Romish group, and now this ideology is the background of this new policy. It means that the world steps into the new era of its development, which is very dangerous, which is unstable, and we don't know the results of these new trends in the world.
And just to remind our listeners, this time our guest speaker was Dr. Boris Shmylov, head of the Center for Political Studies with the Institute of Economics, Russian Academy of Sciences.
Burning Point.
So to sum up what we've been talking about in this program, the recent developments really produce a nasty impression that international legislation has been disrespected, as well as the public opinion in the countries which are generally perceived as the strongest democracies in the world.
So, therefore, it comes as little surprise that some of the leading analysts talk of new conflicts and further corrosion of the current system of international relations.
So these forecasts, as any forecast in fact, might come true or not. But in any case, it looks like continuous chaos, both in global politics and international legislation, would eventually produce a lose-lose situation in which no one would come up as winner. And with this, we end this edition of Burning Point, brought to you by the Voice of Russia radio station. It was presented by me, Ekaterina Kudashkina.
And me, Dan Moody.
Thank you very much for staying with us. Goodbye.
And take care.